Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hot Lights, Cold Steel, Life, Death, and Sleepless Nights in a Surgeon's First Years, by Michael J. Collins, M.D., narrated by John Pruden. Prologue. We start here, and we go there, but it's not that simple, is it? Our paths may be circuitous or direct. We may gaze excitedly ahead or cast our eyes regretfully behind. Until we reach our destination, it exists only in our minds. It is what we have imagined it to be, and yet we tend to neglect the journey, which is real, in favor of the destination, which is not. For too long, I neglected this journey. It was an obstacle to be overcome, an ordeal to be endured. For I had never chosen the journey, I had chosen the destination. But now that the journey has ended, I have discovered that here isn't so important after all. I find myself looking back with particular fondness for how I got here. St. Mary's Hospital Emergency Room, the Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota, June, Year 4. The ER doors crashed open and the paramedics powered through. I trotted alongside them as they wheeled the patient to Trauma 1. 14-year-old kid run over by a tractor, the paramedic said. He was conscious when we got there, BP 100/60. His right leg's a mess, open fracture, dirt everywhere. What's his name? I asked. Johansson, Kenny Johansson. Hang in there, Kenny, I whispered to the unconscious boy. I lifted the sheet covering the lower half of his body, and immediately the thick, fetid stink of manure mushroomed up at me. His leg was twisted obscenely to the side. The jagged end of the tibia stuck through a rent in his dirty blue jeans. A spreading pool of blood soaked the sheet underneath him. As we lifted the boy onto the table in Trauma 1, his eyes flickered open. He began to whimper softly as he searched for someone he knew. I put my hand on the side of his head and rubbed his hair gently. Kenny, you're in the emergency room at St. Mary's, I told him. Your mom and dad are here too. They're in the other room. He rolled his head and moaned. My leg, oh God, my leg, it hurts so bad. I know it does, Kenny, and we're going to help you. BP 78/40, a nurse called out. Pulse 160. I probed Kenny's wound. Under the severed end of the peroneus longus, there was a bloody chunk of manure wedged against the bone. I picked it up with a forceps and dropped it on the floor. When I found what was left of the anterior tibial artery, I clipped it with the hemostat. His bleeding, except for a slow ooze, ceased. In the next several minutes, we did a cut-down, put in a subclavian line, and pumped him full of blood and fluid. Within half an hour, we had his pressure up to 110/60. I told the charge nurse to get an OR ready. As she picked up the phone, she said the boy's parents wanted to talk to me. Mr. and Mrs. Johansson were huddled together on a couch in the far corner of the waiting room. They sprang to their feet as I entered the room. Mrs. Johansson wrapped both hands around her husband's left arm and leaned against him. She kept staring at the bloodstains on my scrub pants. I introduced myself and then told them that although Kenny had lost a lot of blood, his vital signs had improved and he seemed stable. We're just about to take him to the operating room, I said. Before I could say more, the door to the waiting room burst open and a young man rushed in. Dad, he said, I found it. This is my son, Eric, Mr. Johansson said. He went back to the farm to look for the missing piece of Kenny's leg. Eric reached into the pocket of his jacket. He handed me a clean white handkerchief in which he had wrapped a dirty 3-inch section of tibia. I doubted we could use it, but I wanted the boy to feel he had done something worthwhile. Thanks, Eric, I said. This could be a big help. Will you be able to save Kenny's leg? Mr. Johansson asked. At that moment, I was more worried about saving Kenny's life. The boy was in shock and had almost bled to death. I longed to reassure his parents, but I had learned not to make promises. Mr. Johansson, I said, we're going to do everything we can. Please, Doc, please. I nodded, shook his hand, squeezed Mrs. Johansson's shoulder, and sprinted up to the OR. They had taken Kenny to OR 10, the largest of the operating rooms. In contrast to the ER, where everyone had been barking orders, shouting for equipment, and rushing back and forth, the operating room was quiet, almost hushed. Voices were muffled. There was a greater sense of control here. We were surgeons. This was our turf. Against the far wall, the laminar flow machine hummed faintly. The cardiac monitor issued its staccato, reassuring beeps. Two anesthesiologists were wedged shoulder to shoulder at the head of the table. They had just finished the intubation. The scrub nurse stood at the back table carefully arranging her instruments. Two circulating nurses shuttled back and forth with instrument trays from the sterilizer. In the corner, a radiology tech waited patiently next to her portable X-ray machine. I handed the piece of tibia to the circulating nurse and asked her to sterilize it. Then I scrubbed my hands and joined the 5 other residents from various surgical specialties who were clustered around the shattered leg. The extent of the boy's injuries was now apparent. Large sections of muscle, skin, and bone were missing. Parts of nerves and arteries had been torn away. Dirt, manure, and fertilizer contaminated everything. First one, then another of the residents poked at the wound, winced or shook his head, then stepped back. No one was sure what to do. Should we try to save this leg, or should we amputate it? They all looked at me. I was the chief resident of orthopedic surgery. I was the one who had to decide. I stood in the center of the operating room with the bright lights trained on the bloody mess that was Kenny's leg. I tried to put everything else out of my mind. It didn't matter how much sleep I got the night before. It didn't matter what else I had planned for the rest of the day. This poor kid, barely alive, was lying unconscious on an operating table with some stranger about to decide whether to cut off his leg. I hemmed and hawed for a few minutes. The natural impulse, of course, is to save the leg. If there is a chance in a million, take it. The kid was only 14 years old. What did we have to lose by trying? If it didn't work, we could always amputate the leg later. Didn't we owe him at least that much? I wasn't sure. Kenny's leg was so badly damaged that an attempt to save his leg could cost him his life. But what about Kenny? What would he want? If we woke him up and said, "Kenny, your leg is severely injured. Should we cut it off or try to save it?" Did anyone think he would say, "Cut it off"? For Christ's sake, he was only 14 years old. The room was quiet save for the sigh of the ventilator and the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. From behind the drape at the head of the table, the anesthesiologists looked at me questioningly. The other residents stood silent, some looking at the ground, some staring at the gaping wound in front of us. No one moved. No one spoke. They all waited. Year 1. Chapter 1. The Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. July, 4 years earlier. On a sweltering Friday afternoon, the day before we were officially to begin our residency, we gathered in a small classroom on the 14th floor of the Mayo building for our orientation meeting. Crammed into this room were 15 incredibly bright first-year orthopedic surgery residents, and me, a 29-year-old ex-cab driver and ex-construction worker, long on dreams, but short on credentials. We were introduced one by one, Phi Beta this, Alpha Omega that. The Mayo Clinic was the most prestigious medical center in the world, and I began to wonder what I was doing there. I was the red-headed stepchild, the dullest scalpel in the drawer. All the other residents had done several rotations in orthopedics when they were in medical school. Most of them had spent their nights writing papers or doing orthopedic research. When I was in medical school, I spent my nights working on a truck dock. I had done no research, had written no papers, and had done only one rotation in ortho. I had no exposure to the world of adult reconstructive surgery that was such a big part of orthopedics at the Mayo Clinic. After the introductions, a towering man with thick lips and wavy gray hair lumbered up the podium. He introduced himself as Dr. John Harding, the chairman of the department. He welcomed us and then gave us a brief history of orthopedic surgery at Mayo, going all the way back to Doctors Will and Charlie Mayo, who had founded the clinic in the 1890s. He said we were lucky to be starting in orthopedics now. 20 years ago, there were no joint replacements. There was no arthroscopy. The things we can do for our patients now could scarcely have been imagined back when I started in orthopedics. When Dr. Harding finished, a short, wrinkle-faced man with thick glasses approached the microphone. He waited until the room was quiet before he introduced himself. "I am Dr. Benjamin Burke," he said, "the director of the residency program." After a few words of welcome, he reminded us of the sacredness of our profession and told us we had a long but gratifying road ahead of us. "You will spend 4 years here," he said. 2 years as a junior resident and 2 as a senior resident. If you work hard enough, if you're skilled enough, we might consider you for chief resident in your final year." He concluded by saying, "This is the Mayo Clinic. Our patients expect a lot from us, and we are going to expect a lot from you." Finally, Viola Hopkins, Dr. Burke's secretary, passed out our first quarter assignments. "There are 2 Mayo Clinic hospitals," Vi said. "You will spend time at both hospitals, but for the first quarter, 12 of you have been assigned to St. Mary's Hospital. The remaining 4 will be at Rochester Methodist Hospital." She said she looked forward to meeting each of us personally and wished us a happy and blessed 4 years here at Mayo. I tore open my packet. There were 4 names under the heading Rochester Methodist Hospital: Chapin, William T., Collins, Michael J., Manning, John F., Wales, Frank. As we filed out of the classroom, someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Mike Collins?" "Yeah," I said, turning around. A stocky, freckle-faced man with an unruly mass of red hair held out his hand. "Bill Chapin," he said. "I guess we're going to be inmates together." As we shook hands, Bill said, "Have you met these 2 characters yet?" He gestured behind him. A friendly-looking guy with a bushy brown mustache and a string tie smiled and took my hand in both of his. "Wales," he said. "Frank Wales. It's a gall-darned pleasure to meet you." Frank, as I was to learn, was a Wyoming farm boy with a big smile and a bigger heart. I never could figure out how much of his country boy shtick was put on and how much was genuine. "And I'm Jack Manning," said a tall, athletic-looking man with round glasses and a receding hairline. I shook hands with Jack, too, who then asked me where I was from. "Chicago," I said. "The West Side. How about you?" "Corn Country, Des Moines, Iowa." I turned back to Frank Wales. "Frank, where are you from?" "I'm from God's country." "You're from Chicago, too?" "Chicago? Why, son, I'm from Wyoming, Wind River country. Home of elk and bison and wild mustang and mountain peaks stretching as far and as high as the eye can see. I don't reckon you have anything like that in Chicago." I said no, but we had some pretty big rats and cockroaches. After the others left, I went back to the residence lounge and looked through the rest of my packet. I knew that each staff or attending surgeon at Mayo had his own list of patients, his service. A senior resident and a junior resident were assigned to each surgeon. I was dismayed to learn I would be the junior resident with Dr. Harding. Oh, great, I thought. Just what I need to have the chairman of the department find out what a dope he has hired. I imagined him grilling me the next day. "How much research have you done, Dr. Collins?" "Research? Well, I haven't actually—" "What about papers, then? Have you written anything?" "Papers? Have I written papers? Well, not exactly. That is, not a lot. Well, maybe a little here and there, but nothing all that important. Of course, I've been meaning to write them. Lots of them, in fact. I have some ideas, but I've been—" At that point, I would let him know that my people would be getting back to his people on this soon. Fortunately, Dr. Harding, or Big John, as the residents called him, took very little notice of me the next morning. After a perfunctory handshake, he directed his attention to the senior resident, Art Hestry. Art led us up to the ortho floor to make rounds on our patients. At Mayo, rounds are made twice a day. The attending surgeon accompanies his residents on rounds every morning except Sunday. The residents make rounds by themselves every afternoon plus Sunday morning. As we stood outside the first patient's room, Art gave Dr. Harding a brief summary. TKA Day 2, hemovac out, up today, doing well. This apparently meant something to Dr. Harding, who nodded and strode into the room. I shuffled after them, wondering what the hell a TKA was. By staying in the background and keeping my mouth shut, I managed to make it through rounds without making my ignorance too obvious. But I was a sober, frightened young man when we finished rounds that morning. I had a lot of catching up to do. To make matters worse, there was the matter of the Saturday morning conference. Dr. Burke had warned us that all residents were required to attend this conference. I made my way to the hospital auditorium where the conference was just beginning. One of the senior residents was presenting cases. I was in awe of his self-assurance and his command of orthopedic jargon. This is a 52-year-old farmer, status post right medial meniscectomy 30 years ago. He presents with a 10-year history of progressive DJD on the medial compartment. Dr. Coventry did a closing wedge UTO last Wednesday. I sat there in a daze, certain I was the most ignorant orthopedic resident in the history of the Mayo Clinic. I feverishly scribbled notes to myself. UTO, ? And check x-rays on John Svensson. I was familiar with this type of conference from medical school. Cases are presented, then some unfortunate junior resident is asked a series of complex questions that he stammers through and always gets wrong. The senior resident or attending then gives the correct answer. Embarrassing the junior resident is considered a good thing. It is supposed to encourage him to study harder. But I was another story. Although I had been an excellent student in medical school, I had very little exposure to orthopedics. After hearing the impressive qualifications of my fellow residents, I began to think my problem went beyond mere inexperience. Compared to the others, I felt orthopedically anencephalic. I felt brain dead with the plug pulled. I felt so ignorant that had anyone called on me, even my questioner would have been embarrassed. The entire department would shudder if they discovered this moron was among them. At one point, Jack Manning, who was sitting behind me, leaned forward and asked how many UTOs I had scrubbed on. I pretended not to hear him. He might as well have asked how many UFOs I had flown on. At least I knew what a UFO was. I don't think it is possible for a person to shrink down any farther in his seat than I did that morning. By the end of the conference, my head was below the seat back. As we were leaving, Jack said it looked like I was melting, but at least I hadn't been called on. My secret was safe for another week. Even though the conference was over, I slunk out of the auditorium with my head down, still afraid someone might call me back and ask me under what circumstances would a hemiarthroplasty be preferable to a total shoulder replacement. I would have thrown myself on the floor and asked them to shoot me and put me out of my misery. And misery it was. In less than 24 hours, I had gone from the euphoria of beginning my career as an orthopedic resident at the Mayo Clinic to the feeling I was a counterfeit, an imposter who had infiltrated this society of brilliant surgeons. Once my ignorance was discovered, I would be told to report immediately to the director of the residency program. I would be ushered into a dimly lit room lined with cherry wood bookshelves crammed with faded leather-bound medical treatises from the 1700s. A somber-looking Dr. Burke would emerge from the shadows and tell me a mistake had been made. A terrible mistake. He would then hand me an ornately carved wooden box. "Go ahead," he would say. "Open it." I would lift the lid and find a 12-inch pearl-handled dagger, its blade glinting wickedly, resting on a tiny satin pillow. For the good of the residency program, for the good of the Mayo Clinic, for the good of every orthopedic surgeon who had ever picked up a scalpel, I would be urged to do the right thing. Dr. Burke couldn't promise anything, of course, but if I played ball, if I was a team player, there was a chance my body would be given first table in the cadaver lab. I went back to the doctor's lounge and began copying the list of patients on Dr. Harding's service. I planned to go back and review the chart on every patient. I had just finished copying the list when Art Hestry came in. "Mike," he said, clapping me on the back, "I'm going up to the Twin Cities for the weekend. I need you to cover for me. I'll do rounds this afternoon before I leave, but you'll have to make rounds tomorrow." He must have seen the look of horror on my face. "Don't worry. If you have any problems, just call one of the senior residents. They'll help you." He laughed, handed me his beeper, said, "Heck of a deal," and sailed out the door. I stood there for several seconds, staring at this horrible thing, this beeper that rested in my still outstretched hand. Gingerly, as if I were holding a vial of nitroglycerin, I clipped it to my belt. I was terrified that at any moment it might go off and a frantic nurse would scream, "Doctor, come quickly! Mr. Arnold's TQF is transdebilifying on his acute dorsi. His TKA is UTO'd. For God's sake, hurry!" I spent the rest of the day reviewing charts, slowly gleaning bits of information, jotting down on my ever-present index cards things like TKA equals total knee arthroplasty, ORIF equals open reduction internal fixation, UTO equals upper tibial osteotomy. Some things, however, defied my best efforts to decipher them. "Patient is TTWB," I read. "Too tired with bending? 3 times without bleeding? Terribly thirsty without beer?" How in the hell did I know? Of course, I could have asked the nurses, but they would have thrown me out the door for practicing medicine without a brain. At 6 o'clock, I pulled into the driveway of our small frame house on the outskirts of Rochester. My wife, Patty, met me at the back door. Patty and I were both Chicago kids, West Side Irish, born at St. Anne's Hospital at Laverne and Thomas. Over her parents' strenuous objections, Patty had married me in the summer before my junior year in medical school. "So," she said, throwing her arms around my neck, "how was your first day as an orthopedic surgeon?" I cringed. I realized that only by the farthest stretch of the imagination could I be considered an orthopedic surgeon. There were medical students who knew more orthopedics than I did. I kissed Patty and mumbled that my first day was okay. "Then why the sad face? What did you do? Operate on the wrong leg or something?" "Oh, I don't know, hon. I feel so dumb, so out of it. I don't know the first thing about orthopedics." Patty rubbed the back of her hand against my cheek. "That's why they have residencies." One of the third-year ortho residents, John Stevenson, was giving a party that night. He had been thoughtful enough to invite the first-year guys. Patty and I left our 12-month-old daughter Eileen with the babysitter. At 8 o'clock, we rang the doorbell of the Stevensons' apartment. "Come on in," said the guy who answered the door. "John's in the kitchen." The place was packed. It took me 5 minutes to find John. I handed him a 6-pack of Olympia. He thanked me, but said he hoped he wouldn't need it. There was a keg in the kitchen. Patty and I stumbled around, listening to snippets of conversation about things called IM rods and putty plats and ACLs. God, how I longed to find someone who could talk about the Vikings or the North Stars. At least I could speak the language. We passed one of the residents on the hand service. He was talking about an operation they had done on a woman who had cut off her thumb in a lawnmower accident. He said they removed her big toe and sewed it on her hand. I looked around. No one was laughing. The guy was serious. In the kitchen, I finally found Bill, Frank, and Jack. They lifted their glasses in greeting, and we introduced our wives. Alice Chapin, a strikingly beautiful woman, was a redhead, like Bill. I learned that later she had given up a promising career in public relations to move to Rochester. She had just gotten a job at the Rochester Public Library. Jack Manning's wife, Sue, had warm hazel eyes and short brown hair. She was even more athletic-looking than her husband. They had married right out of college. Jack told us they were expecting their first child in March. "March," Bill said, counting the months on his fingers. "When did Sue get pregnant? Last night?" The biggest surprise was Linda Wales, Frank's wife. Linda was an architect. In her crisp blouse and tight skirt, she was as sophisticated and polished as Frank was, simple and rough-hewn. They had married when Frank was in medical school and Linda was getting her graduate degree. John Stevenson, passing by, noticed I was drinking a Coke. "Don't you want a beer, Mike?" "Nah, I'm on call." "On your first night? Junior residents only take call in-house. You can't be on call." Art Hestry went up to the cities for the weekend. He gave me his beeper and left me on call for our service. "He what?" John then called over several other senior residents. He introduced me, then told them Art had left me with the beeper for the weekend. They all laughed. "Typical Art," they said. "Heck of a deal." A minute later, just as I found the pretzels, my beeper went off. I was so startled I almost dropped the bowl. The operator instructed me to call the ortho floor at Methodist. Oh, God, I thought, this is it. Someone's going to tell me I have to rush over to Methodist Hospital and perform some emergency operation I've never even heard of. Heart pounding, I held my Coke over my head and squeezed through the crush of people in John's kitchen. I found a telephone in the bedroom, closed the door, and dialed the number. "Dr. Collins," I said to the nurse who answered. "Dr. Collins," came the puzzled reply. "We were looking for Dr. Hestry." "I'm covering for him." "You are?" she said. "And this is Dr. Collins? I don't think I know you." "Well, I just started today. I'm Dr. Harding's junior resident." "Oh, okay," she said reasonably, and then went on very businesslike. "I'm Ann Cheevers, the nurse taking care of Mrs. Wiltshire. Can we get her up?" I frantically searched my memory. Mrs. Wiltshire. I vaguely remembered the name. I stalled and finally mumbled, "Mrs. Wiltshire?" "Yes, Mrs. Wiltshire in 7214. She had a TKA 3 days ago." TKA, I thought in a panic. Oh yeah, total knee arthroplasty. Well, at least I knew what it was, but could we get her up? I hadn't a clue. I didn't know if we always got people up on the third day or if we never did. Mrs. Wiltshire was probably the wife of the president of Switzerland or something. What if I did the wrong thing? I could see the headlines of the Rochester Post-Bulletin the next day. "Idiot junior resident mistakenly lets wife of Swiss president walk on third day. Leg falls off." I'd be finished. My career at Mayo would have lasted 1 day, although I would have to stay in Rochester for years while the malpractice trial dragged on. "Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury one more time, Doctor, how you crippled this poor mother of 10 who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize." I'd been silent for quite a while when the nurse finally said, "Hello, are you still there?" Yeah, I'm still here." "Well, can we get her up or not?" There was no point in thinking it over. There was no way I could rationally discover an answer. Instead, I did the smartest thing I could have done. I threw myself on the mercy of the nurse. "Look, Anne," I said, "I'm new and I honestly don't know. What do you usually do?" This was her chance. She probably had been humiliated more than once by some egotistical resident. Now was her chance to get some payback. I waited. She was silent for a moment, and then must have taken pity on me. She let the opportunity to humiliate me pass. It wasn't the first time a nurse had helped me, and it wouldn't be the last. "We usually let them up. She's been doing fine. I think Dr. Hestry just forgot to write the order." "Oh, okay. Then it's fine. You can get her up." "Thank you, Doctor." I let out a long breath. "I owe you one, Anne." "That's all right," she said with a laugh. "So where's Art?" I wasn't sure if covering for Art meant lying for him, too. "Art? Oh, well, Art is, yes? He can't come to the phone right now." "Yes, of course. I suppose he's desperately ill. Tell him I hope he feels better soon." "I will. Tell him a couple aspirin and an ice pack on the forehead tomorrow morning might help." "Well, I'm sure Art would never—" "Good night, Doctor." I hung up the phone and breathed a sigh of relief. I had passed my first test. Barely. I went out to the living room and thanked John for...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?